How did they do in terms of the state? How did they do in making their case? Neama?
I love this case for the prosecution. You have a confession, and for the defense to say that it was coerced, I mean, you're really pushing it really hard. And not only do you have that confession, which was both verbal and in writing, you got good jail calls between Joseph Daniels and his father. So really strong case for the prosecution here. This we call a slow guilty plea, in court, because really you can't give any type of deal in a case like this. I mean, it's such a horrific act for a father to beat his special needs son who's nonverbal to death. So I like how the state presented its evidence in this case. I like how they've handled it, and I expect a quick guilty verdict here. Again, in this particular case, you have Joseph who, hid the body. I mean, he lied about it to law enforcement. First, he said it was in the field, and then he threw it into the pond when he went to the bridge. But regardless, I mean, ultimately, like Darren said, I mean, you have testimony from the kids, right? You have Alex, who saw his brother beaten to death, and then his father threatened to kill him. And then, you have Noah that said, baby Joe is dead multiple times. So I don't think you need a body in this case when you have so much other evidence implicating Joseph. Really, what I expect the defense to do, which is what we saw set up during those jail calls, is to point the finger at Crystal. She's having an affair with her boyfriend, maybe argue that it was a setup, but still, very tough case for the defense, and I don't think you need a body to get a conviction in this particular case. Baby Joe on the coffee table. So, and I know there was, the discussion and the cross-examination, why was there no blood, right? Why was there no DNA? Or what about the urine, right? That's the basis for the state's case, that Baby Joe urinated and, Joseph became so incredibly angry, he beat him to death. But I don't think you need all that. And I know the defense is always going to focus on sloppy prosecution, lack of physical evidence. When you have that, it's a very strong confession, over many hours. We watched it here live on Law and Crime a couple days ago, and the jury saw that. They saw the written confession admitting to the same, that, Joseph lied to law enforcement, then changed his story. And again, you have the very powerful testimony from Alex, who's now 11 years old, but was 8 years old at the time, who saw his father kill his brother. And then even, baby Noah coming in, even the young child knew that his brother was dead. So, the defense sort of theory that either Crystal did this, suffocated baby Joe, or the original defense story that baby Joe may have wandered off, opened the lock, and gotten out, not particularly reasonable, as we like to say, stories. I don't think the jury is going to buy that, and that's why I expect the guilty verdict, notwithstanding that lack of physical evidence.
Thanks to both of you for joining us again. So I want to talk about Durst's hospitalization. We know he's been sick. He's been battling cancer. This is a new development, though. Neama, your thoughts on where this puts the case?
We may push it back. Now, we know the court is dark on Fridays, so we haven't been hearing trial testimony on Fridays here in LA, my hometown. But, to the extent that Robert Durst has significant medical issues, and we know he's fighting cancer, and he just already looks significantly different from when the trial initially started about 14, 15 months ago. This may delay things. So this is something that we're going to have to monitor and track very closely, because we all know he's in very poor health.
And I guess the real question is there a doubt now? Is there some serious concern that he might not survive this trial? Neama?
It's possible. I mean, no question. And I agree with Darren. Some of this is tactical. There's been defense motion after defense motion to continue the trial, to argue for mistrials. And that would just set things back months, because it took so long to even impanel this jury in the first instance. So there's that going on. On the first day of trial, apparently Bob Durst refused to come out of his cell, and sheriffs had to go in and get him physically to bring him in for the second day of trial. But there's no question, just looking at him, he doesn't really pass the eye test. He is in frail health. And I agree that although Judge Wyndham wants to push this case forward, to the extent that there are medical doctors who are saying that Bob Durst can't proceed, that may be an issue. And this is a real possibility that this trial may be delayed again.
And this tough issue here of wanting to make sure that justice is served, but also seeing that his health is in bad shape, and what should be done about that?
Again, Neama, hearing this story, hearing about this gangster mentality that Susan Berman exhibited, what do you make of that?
Dan, this is a case about themes because there's not a whole lot of direct evidence here, right? There's the admissions in the jinx, there's the cadaver letter, but this is a really circumstantial case. So the district attorney, specifically John Lewin, is making some key points. One is that Kathy Durst was in an abusive relationship, right? And that she feared for her life for Bob Durst. So there's a lot of witnesses that have come forward that have talked about that. And because Kathy has disappeared, is presumed dead, we're getting her testimony through those witnesses. But also Susan Berman, the fact that she was a daughter of a gangster from Las Vegas. She's not someone that would have opened her door to anyone. She really cared a lot about security, and that's part of the state's theme here, that the fact that she was killed off Benedict Canyon here in Beverly Hills, she must have opened the door to someone that she knew, likely Bob Durst. So this all plays into the state's theory of the case, and it's very important. Not to mention the key evidence when folks that were friends with Susan are saying, hey, if I disappear, look to Bob Durst. He's responsible. Or that I was involved in the cover-up of Kathy Durst, and maybe I'm the one that made the phone call. She didn't go as far as to say that, but she said she did something for Durst related to Kathy's disappearance.
Case that the prosecution was going to have a much more solid case than they do at this point?
Well, Dan, this is a tough case, and there's a reason that the New York District Attorney didn't prosecute Kathy Durst's disappearance in the early '80s. And I got to give credit to John Lewin. This is a very challenging case in terms of the facts, and you have a very good defense team. Dick DeGuerin is one of the best. Chip Lewis. Let's not forget that they famously got Bob Durst acquitted on the Morris Black murder, at least the most serious charges, even though he admitted to chopping up his neighbor, mopping up the blood, and throwing the torso and the rest of the pieces of the body into the Gulf of Mexico. So tough case, but still a righteous case. I'm glad the DA is bringing this forward. To address Darren's earlier point, I mean, this particular judge is very liberal, let's say, when it comes to the rule of evidence. And a lot of things are coming in. This jury is going to see parts or all of the Jinx movie, which is, even though it's a documentary, still fictional. They may even see All Good Things, which is a Hollywood movie. So a lot of evidence is coming in. This particular judge is allowing a lot of leeway. A lot of these issues were addressed in motions in limine, which is why all this is coming in. But again, certainly when it comes to what's coming in and what's coming out, this particular judge has left the door wide open.
Straight out of The Sopranos as to where Kathy Durst's body might be buried. I want to bring back in Neama Rahmani and Darren Gelber. Neama, what is the strategy here? What's the goal about bringing up these phone calls made in Beach Haven and Barnegat, New Jersey?
The strategy here is for the district attorney's office to show a pattern by Bob Durst. Even though he was wealthy, he was notoriously cheap, right? He shoplifts. He actually makes collect calls to his family business because he doesn't want to pay. And this is obviously about 40 years ago, well before cell site evidence that the FBI would come and testify about. So what the state is trying to prove is that not only did Bob Durst kill his wife, Kathy, he was traveling north towards the Jersey Shore, which was famous long before it was a reality TV show, that it's a place where the mob disposed of dead bodies. So they're trying to show this sort of path of travel and this evidence to show that it was Bob Durst who was making those phone calls, collect calls to the family business, and that he was traveling along that path to drop off some clothes, potentially bloody clothes, to be dry cleaned and dispose of his wife's body along the beach there.
Conclusive evidence, or is this just speculation?
Look, it's not hard evidence, but the state doesn't have hard evidence in this case. This is a challenging case for the prosecution. That's why it's a cold case that hasn't been brought for decades. If you're the district attorney's office here, you certainly wish you had some physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, DNA, blood, but you just don't have it. So you really got to piece together a very circumstantial case over a span of months. That's why we expect this case to last upwards of 5 months, and for these jurors to hear all the circumstantial evidence. And you're hoping, if you're the state here, that you can piece the puzzle together piece by piece, and at the end of the case you present it to the jury and that you can get a guilty verdict. But it's a very tough case.
And it's such a tough case, and it's a cold case. Why focus so much on this murder of Kathy Durst and not as much on the murder of Susan Berman? I mean, how much does the prosecution, Neama, have to prove the murder of Kathy Durst, Bobby's connection to it, in order to get to Susan Berman?
I think you have to prove the case if you're the prosecution for 2 reasons. One, you want to really dirty up Bob Durst and show that he's a violent person who's capable of killing his wife. So, that way the jury's not going to like him, because let's be honest, they're looking at a frail old man who I'm sure some jurors think is not capable of these heinous and violent acts. But secondly, the reason you got to prove it is because Susan Berman was Bob Durst's best friend dating back to college here in UCLA. I mean, she was his publicist. So if you're the defense here, you're saying, why would Robert Durst kill his best friend, 20 years after the murder? So you really got to kind of tie the motive together. So it's a hard case, but from the state's perspective, you're saying that Susan knew where the bodies were buried. She was involved in the cover-up because she called Kathy's dean. She was trying to extort him for money. She got $50,000 from him at least. And when Bob Durst, who's notoriously cheap, didn't want to make payments, that's why he killed his best friend. Again, a lot of kind of pieces to put together in this very circumstantial case. But if you don't have that, you really don't have a theory here. If you're the prosecution, it's really the only way they can prove this case is to establish that Bob killed Kathy. And that's why he killed Susan.
On this, Neama, why would the prosecution even call this witness up? I mean, it sounds crazy.
You know what? A lot has changed over my 20 years of handling cases, and I'm sure Darren would agree. We talked a little bit about in the Daniels case, like why would the state call the convenience store clerk, or even the woman who maybe saw baby Joe walking on the side of the street? I think one of the changes and shifts in prosecution strategy over the years is to take control of the case. Call these potentially adverse witnesses in your case in chief. Don't wait for the defense to call him during their case. That way, even if they're hostile, which this witness clearly was, you can kind of take that sting out of it because you go first. The jury hears that evidence in your case as opposed to the defense one. So I don't disagree with the strategy, both in the Daniels case and here in Durst, because I like it when prosecutors try to take control of difficult, hostile, challenging witnesses, even though in this particular case, this is one of Durst's friends, and it certainly didn't go the way the state had hoped.
He knows more than he's letting on, or is he being stubborn, or does he truly not know anything?
Well, he's incredibly stubborn, right, from that first recorded exchange. I mean, as law enforcement, you don't want to identify other witnesses, whether you're a prosecutor or a police officer, an agent, or whatever, because you don't want witnesses tailoring their testimony to one another. I mean, had district attorney just told him that, maybe that would have facilitated the conversation. But he's clearly very combative. Likely, he's on the defense witness list. The prosecution wants to take the sting out of it. That's why they call him in their case in chief. But I mean, I agree with Darren. He does throw in that important nugget that, maybe Kathy Durst just disappeared, took off. That's one of the defense theories here, right? That she's a drug addict, she's unstable, and that she's gone girl and just disappeared off the face of the earth. Certainly possibility, unlikely, but he does help the defense a little bit in at least advancing that argument.
It seems like the prosecution thought that was the very substance that they were looking for.
Dan, I don't envy the second appellate division here. They're going to get a monster transcript and record on appeal. There's already so many appellate issues here related to this 14-month gap due to COVID and starting the trial and restarting, and there's already been writs and petitions to the Court of Appeal here. But it's very kind of fascinating dealing with this witness. I mean, I have seen it where prosecutors start the questioning with, you don't want to be here, you're here because you're compelled to be here, and then ultimately the testimony, the substantive testimony starts. But in this case, it was just pure cross-examination out the gate, and ultimately there were some substantive questions about Bob Durst's demeanor when his wife left, and is that consistent with someone who really cared about his wife and wasn't responsible for her disappearance. But I agree, it's very sort of strange type of testimony in terms of a witness like this being called in the prosecution case in chief, being subject to cross-examination, being so combative and uncooperative, so much so that even the judge, who's been doing this for quite some time, said it's the most problematic witness he's ever dealt with, up there with some hardcore gang members.
Yeah, I mean, he called him the worst. Neama, your thoughts on this witness? Is she credible?
I think she was credible, and again, these are important witnesses for the district attorney's office because they show that Susan Berman suspected that if anything were to happen to her, it'd be Bob Durst, right? So we're actually hearing the testimony of the deceased. Folks may disagree whether it should come in, but really it comes in under the hearsay rule that if the defendant is responsible for the witness's lack of availability, in other words, kills them, these statements can come in. So it is important. A good cross-examination by the defense, though, again, they are some of the best in the business to say that, hey, you were aware of these statements for decades, but you didn't come forward. That was a good area of cross-examination, as well as showing that, Susan Berman herself may have been unstable. These are all kind of defense themes in the case that might point to her being killed by someone else, whether it's mob ties, her manager, her landlord, some other folks that she was having disputes or disagreements with. So I think the defense did a good job there as well. But again, important witnesses for the prosecution.
Trying to dismiss this witness, saying there's bias.
When we're going to the prior consistent statement hearsay exception, so going back to those rules of evidence, many years ago. So generally, these statements do not come in unless the witness is first impeached and there is at least an inference made that the witness is lying or mistaken about his or her testimony. Then the person who originally called the witness, in this case the state, can bring in those prior consistent statements, very different from a prior inconsistent statement, which comes in right away for impeachment. So we heard the kind of back and forth with the attorneys. Actually, it was very civil, unlike most of the discussions between Lewin and DeGuerin in this case, which have gotten really nasty. But again, I think this is important evidence for the state because it shows that, no, Miriam here, she wasn't just making this up decades later because I spoke to her or someone from my team being the district attorney's office spoke to her. This is something that she told law enforcement and others many years ago. So it does help bolster her credibility when you're dealing with a prior contemporaneous consistent statement. Dan, I 100% agree with Darren here. She is the star witness for the prosecution. Let's talk about the 4 things that Robin testified about. She had information about a friend's missing wife. Well, who could that be but Robert Durst, right? And then that she was going to blow the case wide open, right? Number 2. And she was going to talk to someone. 3, because her friend didn't come through, and that's the extortion, that's the money. So she was an absolutely fantastic witness, ties all the pieces together for the state, and I loved her testimony. And I think if Lewin is able to get a guilty verdict from these 12 jurors, it's because of Robin's testimony.
All right, well, you have to wonder what the jury is thinking listening to a witness like this. It's definitely something that will stay with them, that the state will maybe rest their case with. But I want to thank you both so much for joining me this evening. We'll have much more on the trial and many more, so keep watching Law and Crime. Have a good night.